Welcome to the Less Stressed Life podcast. This is your host, Krista Bigler, private practice integrative nutritionist, helping people across the U.S. reverse digestive issues, eczema, and autoimmunity via phone and video consult. To learn more, visit lessstressednutrition.com. Now, on to the show. Okay, today on The Less Stressed Life, we have Kelsey Kinney, who is a registered dietitian specializing in digestive health. She runs a virtual private practice and is the creator of Build Your Biome program and the founder of Gut Power Drinks, which is in front of me along with a myriad of prebiotic products, because today we're talking all about prebiotics. And Kelsey really digs into, is this company good, bad, whatever. So she is really going to school us on the big, not really mystery of prebiotics, but the underserved area of prebiotics. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Krista. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so let's talk about you a little bit. Tell me about where you came from and how you got major interest sparked in prebiotics. Was there some things that kind of built up and you were like, hey, we need to pay way more attention to this? Because I feel like you're sort of prebiotics unpaid mascot sometimes.
I do feel that that's I'm screaming the benefits of prebiotics a lot because I feel like they don't get the screen time they deserve. But yeah, I mean, so early on in my career, like when I was in college studying dietetics, I got really interested in just the whole world of digestive health and specifically the microbiome. I had a professor, for example, who was doing research on glutamine and leaky gut. And so that kind of like sparked it for me, I think. I just got super interested. And so I was doing a lot of research on my own at that time, just, digging into PubMed, Google Scholar, all that fun stuff, because there wasn't a lot of people in the blogosphere, I guess I would say, writing about those topics at that point. And so I was doing a lot of research on my own, and then starting my own practice. Of course, I was starting to implement a lot of that. And after I got my RD, I did my master's at the University of Western States in functional medicine and human nutrition. And one of my professors there, Dr. Jason Hawrelak, was like super into prebiotics. And he kind of really I of course knew about them and was using them to some degree in my practice, but he just had this passion for it that really sparked a passion for them in myself. And so ever since then, I've my wheelhouse has really been the microbiome, probiotics, and prebiotics, and just making sure that people are educated on all of those things, because there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of bad information about all of those topics out there right now because it's such sort of a big thing at the moment. So I consider it my duty as a dietitian who's into this stuff to just educate people on choosing the right products for what you want to get out of them, because it really makes a difference between, what probiotic strain you're considering, for example, or what prebiotic you're choosing as to what it's actually going to do for you.
Oh, you just gave me another question, but let's talk about, first of all, when I was writing kind of some of my questions down for this, you can tell prebiotics are underserved because of my autocorrect. Like, I cannot spell prebiotics without having to go back and edit it a billion times so I don't accidentally put probiotics, because it changes the context. It's not the same at all. So tell us, I think what's important, I was telling you off air, I actually share, Kelsey's got a really great article about prebiotics and kind of Prebiotics 101. And I share it with every client when we start to initiate prebiotics along the process of work, because everyone can learn something from it. No one knows everything about prebiotics. I will just tell you that. So if you think this, is too basic for you, I am here to tell you I do not believe that's the case. So talk to us about what prebiotics are and their role in the microbiome. So give us the 101 quickly.
Sure. So prebiotics differ from probiotics in that they're not a live bacteria. A probiotic is a live bacteria that you are consuming that gives us a health benefit, right? And a prebiotic is something that is basically anything that is non-digestible that affects the host or the human in a beneficial way. So that sounds super vague, but it basically means that anything you consume that helps your beneficial bacteria colonies in the microbiome to thrive is something that would be considered a prebiotic. Does that make sense?
It does. So give us some examples of this.
Sure. So, I mean, you can get prebiotics from your food. So there's definitely things, high prebiotic foods out there like chicory root, for example, or apples, asparagus. There's a lot of things that naturally contain prebiotics. But when we're talking supplements, we start to get into the more kind of technical names. So, for example, inulin is probably the one that I'd say the most people are familiar with. You may have heard of that. You might see it in supplements. You might see it in even like bars or things like that where they want some kind of natural sweetness and an extra health benefit. You might see inulin as an example of a prebiotic. But there's also things like FOS, which stands for fructooligosaccharides, GOS, which is galacto-oligosaccharides, and then sunfiber or partially hydrolyzed guar gum is another example. Those are kind of like my go-tos, I would say, in terms of prebiotics.
Okay. So inulin, which we do see in bars a lot, does that also count toward the fiber? Was that also why we see that on the, because prebiotics could be fibers, right? Like fibers are prebiotics.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So we see that there because it may contribute to the fiber content. I think that's how I feel. I feel like you always see it on fiber stuff. Anything that's like a fiber bar, not to name any names here. Okay. So let's talk about the benefits of prebiotics. For me, I love analogies. So I call prebiotics grass seeds. They kind of help things kind of grow. They like the whole microbiome gets analogies from me about lawn care and Amazon rainforest. And so it's always grass seed to me. I don't know if you use something to try to hammer this home. If so, please interject it. But let's dig into this a little bit. And before I even go on, you were mentioning some food-based sources like chicory, apples, and asparagus. Does cooking these vegetables affect the prebiotic content?
That's a good question. And I actually don't know off the top of my head how much it affects it, if at all. So that's a good question. But a lot of them, they're things that typically you would be eating raw anyway, for the most part. But for example, like I'm just thinking from a supplement perspective, like sunfiber, we put that in hot stuff and it doesn't affect it. So I would think not too much. It's not going to have too much of an effect if you're cooking it. But that is a good question, actually.
Well, and I might
it depends on the prebiotic itself too.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the thing is I think we don't know everything about prebiotics sometimes as well. Like I think I'm going to have some other questions that may not have answers as well. And that's, I was just at a microbiome conference and I was literally asking all the practitioners in my little study circle, like, how do you like to do this? Because it's supposed to do this, but this is how we see it present. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But chicory root, that's not necessarily like everyday terminology necessarily. Where do you find chicory root?
So sometimes you can actually find that in like coffee mixes, for example. It adds sort of a nice flavor to coffee. So some mixes will incorporate chicory root into coffee. So it's something you would steep, kind of like you would coffee or make coffee normally like that. You can also find that often in coffee replacement blends. So herbal kind of things that aim to mimic the taste of coffee, but that are not coffee. So they maybe don't contain caffeine, for example, if that's something you're trying to avoid. Sometimes you'll also see that in bars and things like that. Again, just as prebiotics become more popular and fiber becomes more popular, that's another way that companies are seeming to add that in a more kind of natural sounding way. It's just a root. It's not like they are processing it in any specific way to like make it more essentially concentrated like a lot of other prebiotic supplements do. So you'll see that in bars or food products often as just a way to increase fiber or prebiotic content.
Okay. Yeah, that's the only place I really see it too is like in dandelion tea that's meant to taste like coffee. I mean, I don't really see it very commonly. So let's talk about prebiotics. Like, stepping back again, what do we need these for? Do we even need prebiotics? Like, what's the argument for prebiotics versus can't you just take a probiotic or whatever? Like, why do we need to pay much more homage to prebiotics? What are they doing for gut health and beyond, like maybe blood sugar or other things?
Yeah, great question. So what we know about probiotics is essentially that when you take them, they kind of only stick around in the gut for maybe 2 weeks. They sort of pass through. And of course, they're really beneficial as they pass through. And if you're taking them consistently, then you're sort of always having them in your gut. So that's going to provide a lot of benefits in and of itself as well. But what that doesn't tell us is that when a probiotic is colonizing the gut, it's doing so short term. It's not really changing anything long term, whereas prebiotics have much more potential to do that. Because essentially, if you think about it, they are acting as food for the good bacteria in your gut. So if you are providing food to those cultures on a regular basis, they're going to thrive, they're going to grow, they're going to, as you were talking about with your grass analogy, like you're going to have a beautiful looking lawn, So it really helps to just keep that balance of good and bad bacteria looking really good, and has the potential to kind of maintain that benefit for much longer than, let's say, taking a probiotic does. So that's one thing for me that really sparked my interest in them in the first place, because it seemed like, why the heck are we putting so much emphasis on probiotics when they are kind of a short-term help to the gut? And prebiotics, to me, seem like they can be a little bit of a longer-term solution here. So the reason I use prebiotics, and I make sure, at least as many clients as I'm working with that can tolerate them, incorporate them into their routine, is because it's essentially just feeding that lawn, feeding that gut garden, right? And making sure that it has everything that it needs to thrive and to be balanced appropriately. So it helps to push out bad bacteria, as do probiotics, to be fair. But I see it more as a long-term thing, whereas probiotics I view as short-term.
So if we don't take prebiotics, what's the flip side of that? Then we just have these transient passerbys, like somebody blowing by, like that's like, oh, it's like turf grass. Right. That, like, if you don't, it's a little more finicky, right? It takes a little bit much to stick, right?
Exactly. And the other thing to consider when you're not really providing prebiotics and fiber and those kinds of things to your gut microbiome on a regular basis is that it leaves you with oftentimes leaves you with lower counts of healthy bacteria. So those colonies kind of wane when they don't get food, which makes sense. Obviously, we're not providing them what they need to thrive. And that in and of itself can be really detrimental, because and I like to talk about the microbiome as a parking lot, where there's kind of only so many spaces in the parking lot, and really you want to have a balance between good and bad that are taking up those parking spaces. So if you imagine that if you're not providing the food that your good bacteria need to thrive, they start to kind of leave the parking lot, right? And then that gives the bad bacteria more of an opportunity to take over more of those parking spaces. And so that balance becomes imbalanced, and we get what's called dysbiosis, which is just, the technical term for microbiome imbalance, which we know can lead to a lot of other health conditions, or just kind of perpetuates other health conditions. So that balance is really, really important. And to be able to provide prebiotics, or that food for good gut bacteria, that helps us to maintain a healthy balance in that parking lot of the gut microbiome.
Okay, so we're talking about like good cars and bad cars in the parking lot. Where do the bad cars come from?
Well, they can come from a lot of different places, and some of it we don't totally know. As you were mentioning before, there's a lot about the gut microbiome that we don't know at this point. But there are things, for example, that affect kind of that balance right from the beginning of our lives. For example, if you were delivered via C-section, you kind of you start off, with the deck stacked against you, basically, in terms of good and bad bacteria. And then things like consuming a really heavily processed diet that's full of, really simple carbohydrates can tend to have a negative impact on the microbiome. Or there's even research, and I'm a little bit torn on it, and I have an article on my blog about it, but a high-fat diet can be potentially detrimental to the balance of good and bad bacteria as well. So there's a lot of dietary lifestyle factors that can play a role in kind of allowing these bad bacteria to overgrow. But in and of themselves, we can kind of consider them more commensal. Like they don't really cause us much problem unless they start to overgrow. And that's when we get into trouble. But then you can also, travel, you pick up a parasite. So that would be another example of a bad bacteria that kind of has the potential to be pathogenic, provided that it gets into your system and starts to cause problems.
You mentioned a term that I don't think is layman, and even though people that listen to this podcast are really smart, I want to mention that commensal would be like the normal residents of the parking lot, essentially. Like here's the way we think of the normal people. Okay, so let's go back to some of that health benefit. Like, what's it look like when you add prebiotics into your clients' lives in terms of gut health, blood sugar, maybe other symptoms you don't even realize that are related? Like, do you have some examples of where you've added prebiotics and what the impact of that has been?
Yeah. So, I mean, I work a lot in digestive health. That's kind of my main area where I work with clients. So the main benefit I'm seeing when I'm incorporating prebiotics into my clients' lives is an improvement in digestive symptoms. So things like stool quality, stool frequency, bloating, gas, which sounds ironic because a lot of people can react poorly to prebiotics actually, and in that they get more gas, more bloating. But that, I mean, we can maybe talk about this in a second, but that just it can depend from person to person. It can depend on the type of probiotic that you choose. So there's a lot of nuance within choosing a prebiotic that can help you to avoid those kinds of symptoms too. But what I'm seeing on the whole, at least in my practice, is an overall improvement in digestive symptoms. And that actually has been really interesting to see over time in terms of me using prebiotics with my clients in practice, because I used to be like really gung-ho about antimicrobials and, would kind of use them basically in all cases. And these days, now I'm really taking more of a look at the nuance in like my GI map results, for example, so stool testing, and kind of really taking a look at what their good and bad bacteria looks like. And I recently had a client who we didn't see a ton of overgrowth of bad bacteria. There was definitely some, but it wasn't crazy. But she had really, really low counts of good beneficial bacteria in her gut. And so instead of kind of focusing on the killing phase, throwing a bunch of antimicrobials at her, we focused more on prebiotics and probiotics and helping to sort of rebalance that parking lot. And she improved really rapidly, is feeling awesome, and didn't have to go through, the antimicrobial protocol, which can be kind of a pain in the butt for a lot of people. So I've just started to kind of move more in that direction. And of course, it totally depends on the client. Sometimes they really do need the antimicrobials to kind of get rid of bad bacteria. But I think a lot of practitioners are still kind of stuck in that mindset of kill, kill, kill when it comes to the microbiome versus cultivating a well-balanced microbiome.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is why it's nice to have a baseline from the stool test, because you don't necessarily know. Someone's symptoms seem generally dysbiotic, but there is overgrowth dysbiosis and insufficiency dysbiosis. So you're just discussing that, there wasn't very many good cars in the parking lot, but that was maybe a more pressing need than the bad cars that were there. Sometimes there's just not really there's just really no one home, essentially. And so you can't really get work done when there's no one there. Like no one showed up for work. Like no one is in the parking lot. So it makes sense that that's the priority. Like let's put some people to work before we see to improve the balance overall. Because if we just bring people to work and put their cars in the parking lot, maybe that's all you need. So I would agree with that for sure. And especially with kids, I think there can be a lot of, like you said, nuances. And I think there's a lot of gray area, kind of knowing what people's symptoms are and then what's beneath the surface. So like, what do we really think? Because sometimes, and I'm sure we could talk about this for a while and we won't, but sometimes you'll see those undergrowth patterns, but they really do have, so like start and really improve, so bring some people to work first and then kind of see where they're at, because sometimes there's things hiding in the back side. So maybe there's not a lot of cars in the front parking lot because they're like hiding, like there's more bad ones hiding in the back parking lot, and I don't know. So anyway, I'm not making sense with my analogies here, but let's talk about dysbiosis in general, because when I use the word dysbiosis, even with people I'm working with, like at the very beginning, sometimes they're like, what is that again? That is an imbalance of bacteria, which I feel like is more pervasive and prevalent. That's like I feel like that's the most prevalent problem across everything. Like, I feel like
I
that's a
think so
huge
too.
issue. We might be biased, right? So you look at a lot of stool tests and you're like, oh, I think like or imbalances are just like the biggest issue of all. But that's the big deal. So let's talk about what's trendy, not trendy here. So we know that there's this term out there, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It's really trendy. People kind of know what it is now a little bit. I always kind of refer more to large bowel dysbiosis. We don't even have to really get too specific about that if we don't want to. I think it's really important to go over large bowel dysbiosis. What I want to say here, what I want to ask you is, what about prebiotics early on? So you just gave an example where you brought more cars to work, right? So you improved things and it really helped. But what if there's a lot of overgrowth and people don't really respond? Like, do you think that that's the time for prebiotics when there's a lot of overgrowth? Do you think people respond well to that? Let's talk about some times where people don't respond well to prebiotics, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, so it happens fairly often where somebody takes a prebiotic and, like I was saying before, they maybe get more gas, more bloating than they started with. And for many people, those may have been the symptoms that they kind of started with. And so to get more of that feels terrible. Not great. Not what they're looking for. And it's somewhat common because what prebiotics are doing is when they're kind of feeding the good gut bacteria, those gut bacteria will produce gas as a result of that kind of reaction, basically. And so you can imagine that if you're producing more gas in the large intestine, that's going to cause some bloating, can cause some gas, can even cause like some reflux for people. So there are definitely side effects to prebiotics. And so that can make it almost a catch-22 because the people that have like this severe imbalance could really benefit from prebiotics, but they can't tolerate them. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely something I've run into quite a bit, but I think it honestly comes down to the specific person and the specific prebiotic that we choose. So since doing a lot of research on prebiotics, I've discovered some that will tend to be better tolerated. For example, Sunfiber, that partially hydrolyzed guar gum I mentioned before, that one tends to be super well tolerated. Like I can count on probably one hand, like the amount of clients that actually have not done well with it. Goss is also one that tends to be a little bit better tolerated, whereas something like inulin, you got a high percentage chance that somebody's going to not react really well to that, especially if they've got kind of overgrowth of bad bacteria and just like a lot of bacteria in the gut in general. Same thing with FOS, also tends to be a little bit harder to deal with when there's significant overgrowth of bad bacteria. So what I've discovered in practice is not that we don't necessarily need to use, or we don't need or want to use prebiotics in those kind of cases. It's just more that we need to choose the right prebiotic for those kinds of cases. But there are definitely people who, you know, maybe they've got really severe overgrowth and just any prebiotic is not treating them well. And at that point, I think that's a good indication that, you know, things are just kind of wildly overgrowing. And if we're just we're almost adding fuel to the fire with a prebiotic sometimes. And in those cases, I find that it's really beneficial often to incorporate some antimicrobials first for a little while, maybe a few weeks, and then try prebiotics again and use something like Sunfiber that tends to be a little bit better tolerated when we do add them back in, and hopefully they'll tolerate it at that point.
Why is Sunfiber and GOS better tolerated than FOS and inulin?
It's a good question. I think just because of the way that it's processed, you know, that partially hydrolyzed bit, I think helps it to be able to be tolerated a little bit better. And that's just what they've found in their research. The company that makes Sunfiber, or, you know, other companies make partially hydrolyzed guar gum as well. And we see that in the research that just because of the structure of it, that it tends to be better tolerated in that regard than something like inulin, that is like kind of longer chain, like tends to be really hard to break down, you know, just even from a bacterial standpoint. And I think that can cause some problems for people.
All right. So if we've got prebiotics in their food for the guys we want to keep around. So if we've got probiotics that kind of pass through, they're kind of transient, they're turf grassy. I like the car analogy because that makes more sense for transient people. And we want to feed them. So we want to put gas in the car, right? Let's just say we want to feed them. So that's prebiotics, let's say. Is there an argument that certain prebiotics are going to feed the bad ones as well? Because bacteria?
Great question. And this is something that I see a lot of confusion over, and there's a lot of misconceptions about prebiotics in this regard. But the technical definition of a prebiotic is that it can only feed healthy, beneficial bacteria. So it by definition cannot be feeding bad bacteria to be considered a prebiotic. So I think that's the main difference, and that's something to really consider, because I do think there's a lot of people that think that taking prebiotics, especially in the SIBO world, I kind of hear this a lot, that if they take a prebiotic, it's only going to make things worse and it feeds bad bacteria. But with SIBO, you can have an overgrowth of healthy bacteria just in the wrong place. So it does mean prebiotics can be potentially problematic in a case like that, because it depends on what bacteria is overgrowing. And if it's a beneficial bacteria, then a prebiotic could potentially not be the best idea. Although there is a lot of research to support prebiotic use in SIBO. So I'll throw that in as an aside. But the technical definition is that it cannot feed bad bacteria. Prebiotics can only feed healthy bacteria.
So and that makes sense. I like the definition. I just wonder if we know sometimes. I don't know. I mean, because when you see it present in cases, sometimes you're like, I wonder what's really going on in there that we cannot really say.
Yeah. And that's what's so kind of, in a way, I think, interesting and fascinating about this area of research, but I'm sure a lot of other people would say very frustrating as well, is that we don't know everything. We're kind of at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to microbiome research. So a lot of the stuff that we know or think we know now might change very soon. We're learning things every day about this stuff. So I try to keep up to date on it, and I change things as I need to. And of course, I'm sure we just sort of pay attention to what's happening in clinical practice. And if things aren't working, then we don't do them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And sometimes things don't make perfect sense, or they're just not straightforward, right? So like gut health isn't about probiotics and prebiotics alone, obviously. Someone said to me the other day she was feeling a bit frustrated because she was doing a lot of sulfur-based compounds, which is a long story, but she's doing sulfur-based compounds, which you need to do all these natural processes, detoxification, but a lot of things that are high in sulfur compounds can feed not the greatest cars. Like, it's not the best gas for them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like something that should be really good. It doesn't work very well when there's an imbalance of bacteria. I think basically when there's an imbalance of bacteria, nothing works right. That's like the bottom line.
Yeah.
Nothing works
it
right.
messes the whole system up.
It does. Yeah. Your hormones don't work right. Like, so many things don't really work right. Okay, let's talk about some products. And actually, I want to give a little bit of homage to foods a little bit more before we talk about products for a bit. So,
Sure.
When in your nice comprehensive article about prebiotics, you talk a lot about polyphenols. So let's talk about polyphenols and their role as prebiotics as well.
Yeah, this is one of the areas I think is really cool, because it goes to show, of course, that diet can play a big role in how our microbiome functions. And this is something that we know, of course, but to see it play out with polyphenols, I think is really fun. So polyphenols are, a lot of us know of them kind of just as like an antioxidant, if we've heard of the term polyphenols ever, which many of us probably haven't too. But essentially, polyphenols are a type of antioxidant that can act as a prebiotic. So they're a little bit different than kind of our classic prebiotics, which we think of more as like types of fibers. These are more like antioxidant compounds that our gut bacteria can essentially eat. And when they eat them, they actually transform those polyphenols into other compounds that we can then absorb into the bloodstream, and they act as like inflammatory compounds or have other beneficial effects throughout the rest of our body. So they kind of help us in two ways, right? They feed our gut bacteria, and then our gut bacteria can transform them into other beneficial compounds that we can then absorb. So they're really, really cool. And of course, we can get them from our diet. Quite easily, actually. So when I think about polyphenols, I think about color. Just the more color you consume, polyphenols are essentially what give our plant matter their different colors. So I try to get people to consume a wide array of colors in their diet, and to try to, I like to say, eat 40 plus different types of plant foods over the course of a week. And that can sound a little ambitious, but then start to think about, okay, tea counts, your spices count, even things like wine count, and all those different colors. So maybe like a purple carrot versus an orange carrot, those count as two separate things. So kind of just starting to take account of all the different colors of plant foods that you consume over the course of the week and trying to improve on that from week to week can go a long way towards improving your gut microbiome. And research shows us too that the different colors, those different polyphenols, all kind of feed different healthy bacteria. So you end up with a much more diverse gut microbiome. And in general, what we see in the research is that the more diverse your microbiome, kind of the healthier you are. So the more that we can do to encourage a diverse microbiome, the better. And that's exactly what we can do by incorporating lots of different colors of plant foods.
Mm-hmm. I like this because, and I'm going to just mention something. If you think about clients, I think you are the same as me, as I sort of get to know people pretty well. Like I can just remember them generally pretty well. And if I think about people who do better faster, I think it's people who have focused on food quality as part of their overall diet, right? So like it's good quality foods and high polyphenol. And so that makes a difference because some people will be kind of like on or kind of trying to adhere to a good diet. And then they're like, well, but they have sort of a broken food relationship, or they haven't really shifted their relationship to a great foundation. So therefore it's super on and off. It's like on a wagon, off a wagon, on a wagon, off a wagon. Right. And those people really struggle to improve like they should long term, rather than those who have just have a great foundation and we're doing lots of tweaks that are very specific to them. Like those people improve better. And I think this is probably one of the many reasons, right? I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think this is one of the possibilities. Is like we're getting a broad spectrum of really high quality foods that are doing way more than sometimes we give them credit for.
This is something that as I've started to focus on it more with my clients, I see better improvements in their symptoms, because it just, there's so much that we can do with prebiotics and probiotics from a supplement perspective, but the more we can focus on just kind of that foundation, like you said, of a really healthy, consistent diet, and really that consistency is important because it's then consistently providing fuel and sort of the right material to the microbiome, the better outcomes I think we see.
Well, and on that note, we do know that it only takes a very short time. We used to think it took, I could get this wrong, but it's going to be good enough for this. I think we used to say, you used to see microbiome changes in 72 hours from diet, but I think it's actually more like 24 to 36 now. You can shift the microbiome quite quickly.
Yep. I was just actually reading a research article recently that kind of showed that even in 24 hours, they can see pretty significant changes in the microbiome when they switch up significantly the food source. So basically the way I like to think about it is at every meal, you have an opportunity to either encourage a healthy microbiome or fuel a bad microbiome. So the choices you make consistently add up over time to either a healthy, diverse, balanced microbiome or a microbiome that's lacking in beneficial bacteria, that has an overgrowth of bad bacteria, just that general kind of imbalance that we see.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a good reminder for all of us because it's easy to we all need those reminders, right? And I personally am motivated by good science. Like I have a healthy relationship with food, but sometimes I just don't have a plan and I don't have things in my fridge. And so it's just good to be remotivated by okay, as a reminder, here's how things are awesome. Okay. So I've got some prebiotics in front of me. And this one's got acacia fiber, Jerusalem artichoke fiber, and green banana flour. Talk to us about this and your opinions on those products.
Yeah. So I think a lot of, there's definitely companies that focus more on the natural prebiotics that you find in whole foods, which can, of course, be very beneficial. But I think they tend to, at least what I've seen in practice, and I'd be curious to hear your experience as well, but they tend to be a little bit tougher, I think, for people with digestive issues to tolerate well. Whereas there's other products on the market, for example, like we were talking about sun fiber or partially hydrolyzed guar gum before, that are a little, it almost sounds bad because they are a little bit more processed and a little bit more concentrated and just kind of, it's not a whole food by any means in that context. But because of that, I find that people actually tend to do better with it. And I think we almost get better results from a microbiome standpoint with them as well. So with products like that, I get a little bit worried, and I tend not to recommend them as much as kind of the more pure forms of prebiotics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I really only bring in a product like this if we've already tried other things and we kind of are running out of options. So I actually have been defaulting to GOS products, but the one that we frequently use is Bimuno, and because it's derived from milk, I have some people, like, it's not milk at all, but some people who have extreme dairy issues and their rear end is going to burn when they have something like that. It just doesn't work for them. So there's a small subset of people it doesn't work for, but most people really like it because it dissolves really well. I did have someone who didn't do well with Sunfiber, so she wouldn't use Bimuno due to autoimmune-ish concerns with dairy, and then Sunfiber, I can't remember the symptoms. I can go look and then tell you what they were, because I feel like I pretty much sometimes it feels like, if there could be something that goes wrong, I feel like I have a few of those. And so
it happens.
It happens. It's totally, and the goal is that those things correct, but when things are broken, sometimes it just doesn't work for a while.
Totally.
Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but I tend to use it if I need something else. So, like, we just run out of options sometimes. But I like that. It's nice to have points of reference. Like, I love the 40 types of plant foods over the week. I've been trying to determine how I want to say that. Like, get like at least these different types of prebiotics. But, I was just at this microbiome conference, and there was a PhD RD there from Cleveland Clinic, and she's doing synbiotics, which is probiotics and prebiotics. And this is a good segue to talk about some other synbiotics on my desk. But anyway, they were looking at synbiotic trials and using prebiotics, probiotics at the same time and seeing these really impressive outcomes with like liver disease and all types of things. And they were using potato fiber. So it's just kind of interesting, the things being used. And I'm really curious to continue to see where we're sourcing from and what results are we getting from those things.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember, too, that kind of like probiotics, where every strain has a different effect and kind of a different outcome. So you need to choose probiotics based on the outcome you're looking for. Prebiotics are kind of similar. Like, certain prebiotics will fuel different types of good bacteria maybe a little bit better than another. So it's a little bit different than probiotics, just because you don't need to be quite as specific. But let's say someone has really low bifidobacteria, for example, like Bimuno might be the best choice for them because it's highly bifidogenic. Whereas Sunfiber, you kind of need more of it to kind of get that effect. So I think it's important to remember that with prebiotics, and I'm sure we're going to learn more as more research comes out. And also that, if you're someone who wants to kind of have the healthiest gut microbiome as you can, it's not a bad idea to rotate your prebiotics or incorporate more than one. Like, it's not the kind of thing where it's a one and done, as much as I would like it to be. So I think incorporating different kinds, and of course getting stuff through your diet, you just want to be well-rounded about it, because that's going to give you the most well-rounded microbiome.
Right. I agree. Definitely don't stick to one food for your probiotics. Otherwise, you're just going to feed that particular bacteria, as you just said.
Right.
So I've got a synbiotic on my desk from Kelsey Kinney here, and it is a prebiotic and probiotic matcha tea. Tell us about this, why it's matcha, why it's sunfiber, why it's bacillus coagulans, which is essentially these are the only ingredients in this product. Yes.
Yeah. So I hate taking pills. So that was honestly kind of the impetus for creating this in the first place. I wanted supporting your gut microbiome to be an easy experience, something that I actually enjoyed incorporating. And at the time I was consuming matcha, I wasn't doing super great with coffee at that point in time. So I was like really getting into matcha, because not only did I tolerate matcha much better than I did coffee at that point, but I was also really into the idea of matcha because of its polyphenol content. Think about matcha, this bright green powder. Like that's to me, when you're trying to think about incorporating more color into your diet, that's like a great way to do it. So I loved it from that perspective as well. And so what I was doing was just adding probiotic like powdered probiotics and then prebiotics, which I was always buying in powdered format anyway, adding them to my matcha. And I was like, huh, this actually works super great. And adding the prebiotic helped it to even like mix in with the water better. I don't know, if anybody drinks matcha out there, that like whisking it or blending it, it's a pain. So having the prebiotic in the product actually helped to make it super easily mixable as well. So it ended up making the process easier. I was getting extra health benefits from it by incorporating the prebiotics and probiotics, and I was getting the polyphenols that I wanted to from the matcha. And I just thought that it was, such an easy way to support gut health that I wanted to bring it out into the world for other people to buy and use in their life as well. And when doing that, I wanted to make sure, of course, with my background and knowing all about this stuff and being really into the research, that I was using a prebiotic that was heavily researched, heavily, evidence-based and clinically studied, that actually I was seeing a lot of benefits with in my own practice with my clients, and then also a probiotic that had a lot of research behind it as well. So I ended up choosing Sunfiber. We've been talking about that quite a bit for the prebiotic, because like I was saying before, that is often, and again, I work mostly in digestive health, so people with like IBS type of symptoms, reflux, that kind of thing. So I wanted something that I could give to the majority of my clients and they would be able to tolerate it really well. So I chose Sunfiber for the prebiotic for that reason. And of course, it's got a ton of great research behind it, specifically in the areas of regularity. So, if you've got someone either with diarrhea or constipation, it's kind of unique in that way that it can help on both ends of the spectrum. Really does a lot to help regulate bowel movements. And then also there's some really interesting research about prebiotics in general, and their role potentially in kind of getting the brain to work better. So in conditions like anxiety or depression. So while I don't think there's any research on Sunfiber at this point in that regard, I'm really interested to see where that goes. So I chose a prebiotic that I knew a lot of people would be able to tolerate. I didn't want people, when they first try a product like this, especially if they haven't done any prebiotics before, to immediately not tolerate it and just throw it in the trash. I wanted to make it something that most people would do okay with. And then I chose the Ganodin BC30. That's the Bacillus coagulans strain that's in the product, because it has a lot of research behind it, specifically in the areas of digestive and immune health, which I know, for many people, myself included, that's like really what I want to focus on in something I'm consuming every day. And it is heat stable. So it meant that you could have your matcha hot or cold. So that's pretty unique. And there's not a lot of well-researched probiotic strains out there that you can say that for. So because of those reasons, I chose that probiotic strain. And then I did a lot of digging into the matcha itself to find the cleanest matcha that I could find and the best tasting, because unfortunately there's a lot of matcha on the market that just doesn't taste very good. So I wanted to make sure that, we were using something organic that was tested for heavy metals and, things like that. So making sure that it was really clean, really great for people, and tasted awesome. And that's it. Those are the only 3 ingredients. I wanted it to be really simple. And I have been loving it. And I've been hearing from a lot of our customers that it's making their life easier in terms of supporting their gut health in a way that fits easily into their routine. So I'm excited to see where that goes. But it's been a really good experience so far.
Yeah, it's really fun. Then, there's something about, you don't see this very often on labels. You're telling us the source of where you got this from, which I know is really big to you. And I feel like now that I know where you kind of like really got into prebiotics, I feel like this is a discussion you have when you sort of know how things are manufactured. Because I've got a bit of a history with food product development and food companies and whatnot. And you just know about like where things come from when you're in the back end. I feel like maybe that's where that passion came from. Because once you know where things come from, you're like, oh, that's not as good as the other thing with the same name, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of like especially with probiotics these days, a lot of the products on the market, they don't tell you what strain they're incorporating because they don't want someone could take my product right here and literally copy it very, very easily. But it was important to me to tell my customers exactly what is in my product and exactly how much so that they know what they're consuming. That was just like one of the things I knew going into this that I wanted to do. And yes, it opens me up to copycats and things like that, but I just felt really, really strongly about that because I don't see it in other companies on the market. And it makes this whole world of microbiome health and probiotics and prebiotics, it just makes it so confusing for consumers to choose products that they know are actually going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. It is very good matcha. Thank you so much for sending me some.
I
can't wait to see it. I know like there's pros and cons to this, but I love having individual packets for travel for, lots of reasons. So I look forward to where this comes, where this goes. And I am well aware of the caveats to being in cocoa, but I'd love it in cocoa too. Wouldn't that be fun? So anyway, dreams.
That's my next flavor. Hopefully is actually going to be a cocoa. So it's coming.
Good. Well, I'm very excited about that. So, Kelsey, where can people find you?
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram at It's Kelsey Kinney, and also at Gut Power Drinks if you're interested in the matcha side of things, and on Facebook by the same names as well. And then you can visit my website at kelseykinney.com, or for Gut Power Drinks, you can go to gutpowerdrinks.com.
Cool.
And also, I wanted to, in case anybody is interested in trying the matcha, you guys can get 15% off with code HELLO if you put that in at checkout, if you'd like to try that.
Cool. We'll make sure that hits the show notes, the code HELLO for 15% off at Gut Power Drinks. Thank you for that.
Of course.
It was such a pleasure to chat about this. And, when we kind of like the same stuff, I feel like we could talk about it all day. So give us a reason to have another conversation. Either open up your voice memo app on your phone and record a question for Kelsey and send it over to hello@lessstresslife.com, or go to lessstresslife.com or Less Stress Nutrition and click on the widget on the side that says, what's it say? SpeakPipe. And you can record your question right there directly. And then make sure you hit pause so it actually sends. We'd love to have Kelsey back and answer Q&As if we get enough questions. Thanks so much, Kelsey.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Krista.
One of the best gifts you could give us at the Less Stress Life is your feedback. We are paid in podcast reviews. If you enjoyed this or any other episode, please leave us a review. In the iTunes store or from your podcast app, just search for Less Stress Life as if you're not already subscribed. Click on the banana face image, scroll to the bottom where it shows the text of other reviews, and write a review. While you're there, hey, make sure you hit subscribe. For Android or Stitcher users, you gotta go to the desktop site and search for Less Stress Life, and then scroll down to leave a review. Stitcher doesn't load Apple reviews on their site, so if you want, you can leave a review in both places. Your feedback means a lot to the success of the show. Thanks so much for taking the time to do that. You rock.